This terrible story took place in the Ninides in one of the villages. The sun was slowly slipping towards the horizon and turning into a fiery red ball, coloring the sky scarlet and pink. It was still light, but soon the world around them would fade, lose its brightness, the birds would stop chirping, and night darkness would descend on the village. Soon night fell, but Emily could not go home yet because her favorite cow, Bella, had not returned from the herd, and Emily was exhausted looking for her. When the shepherd brought the herd in, Emily went outside the gate and did not see her cow among the other cows. She must have gotten loose from the herd again, Emily thought, or the wolves ate her after all. After scolding the drunken shepherd, Emily, along with her husband and older children, went in search of the cow. In those years, the loss or death of a cow could mean starvation for a poor family in the coming winter, or, at the very least, a drastic deterioration in their financial situation. Since the day was fading fast, and the cow had to be found before dark, it was decided to split up and search for the animal in several directions at once. The husband went to the forest, the children to the ponds, and Emily to the meadow, behind which there was an old cemetery where dead people from all around were buried. The woman was not afraid of the night and the coming darkness, and what was there to be afraid of in her native village? Everyone knows each other. There are no robbers in these parts. Wolves are afraid of people like fire. And the most terrible man in the village is Mike, and he is terrible only for his wife, only when drunk. Bella. When Emily came to the meadow, she called her cow, but there was no cow in the meadow. There was no one in the meadow at all except Emily and the grasshoppers. She walked on, and the meadow was left behind. Next, she crossed the creek and walked toward the cemetery. In this area, they buried people without headstones. They just poured earth over the dead person, put a stone on top, put a cross on top, and that was it. After a year, the grave was overgrown with grass, and the cemetery was a continuous hilly grassy field with crosses without any fence. Cows sometimes wandered into the cemetery to eat the succulent grass. Emily crossed the ravine, where the shadows of the night were already thickening, and found herself right in front of the cemetery. The sun had already set, but the sky was not yet black, although the first stars had already appeared. The evening twilight had arrived. There were no trees in the cemetery, and the cemetery itself was small. After looking around and making sure that Bella wasn't there, Emily decided to go back and look for the cow in the bushes. When she turned around, she saw him. It was a scary-looking man with long black hair, standing only 10 paces away from her. But even in the twilight, it was obvious that although he was a man, he was clearly not human. Once, long ago, when he had been alive, he had been human. Now he was a horrible monster with a bloated body, a sagging belly, a red face, and bloodshot eyes. Despite this appearance, the monster was quite fast. In 2 leaps, the dead man was right in front of Emily. The poor woman was so frightened that her heart nearly jumped out of fear, and goosebumps the size of cockroaches ran down her back. Emily's legs turned to absorbent cotton, and the woman was literally paralyzed with fear. A second later, the vampire's icy hands closed around her neck with long, sharp claws instead of fingernails. The horrible vampire threw Emily to the ground and began to strangle her, piling his ghastly carcass on top of her. "It's a dead man." The woman thought with horror. "It's a dead man." Emily couldn't breathe. The blood pulsed in her head and throbbed in her temples. Her chest burned with fire. Emily gasped. The world was leaving her. The dead man leaned toward her and grinned. The woman was horrified to see that all the teeth in the dead man's mouth were bloody and as sharp as a knife. Emily thought for a moment about the children. "God save me," she thought, and after a moment, she felt her hands loosen. Emily inhaled convulsively. The vampire was no longer sitting on her. He stood up and stared somewhere in the distance, where a white blur with red sides had come from. Emily recognized her cow. and in the meantime, it rushed at the ghoul and put it on its horns. The ghoul flipped beautifully in the air and flopped heavily to the ground, but Bella kept up with it. The cow stubbornly trampled the living corpse with her hooves and stabbed it with her horns, so that shreds flew all over the cemetery. Throwing the trampled vampire into the ravine, the cow walked up to her mistress, looking at her with her brown eyes. Emily hugged Bella and then looked at the place where the ghoul lay, but there was no one there anymore. When the whole family was gathered at home, Emily told them what had happened to her at the old cemetery. The next day, the village men, armed with shovels and axes, set off towards the cemetery. The villagers guessed who could turn into a vampire. It was Mike, who had died the previous year. Immediately after his death, he started going to his wife's house. The wife claimed that he came to her at night and sucked blood. Soon the widow and her children left with relatives in California, and Mike stayed here. The countrymen came to the cemetery and dug up the grave. They were horrified. Not only had the body not decomposed, but it had undergone a terrible metamorphosis. He was swollen and maroon, and his mouth was bleeding. But that was not all. The corpse had wounds inflicted by cow horns and hooves. Its stomach had been ripped open, and its entrails had spilled out inside the coffin. Without wasting time, one of the men pierced the body with a stake and nailed it to the ground with the same stake. The corpse wheezed loudly, and the people standing around it crossed themselves. Then the body was doused with holy water and buried again. With a sense of accomplishment, the men went home. From now on, the vampire Mike no longer bothered anyone. Evil was destroyed forever. This is the legend of the vampire. And what do you think, dear subscribers? Ahead of us awaits many more interesting and scary stories. Subscribe to my channel, Underground Scream, and do not forget to give it a like. Bye-bye.